My child asked why I hadn't locked him out yet, and I learned his previous home locked kids outside as punishment. Daniel had been living with me for 2 weeks when he said something that made my blood run cold. It was early October, getting dark earlier each evening, and I'd just called him in from the backyard where he'd been kicking a soccer ball around. He came inside immediately, always compliant, always watching my face for reactions. I told him dinner would be ready in 20 minutes and he could go wash up. He stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, not moving, just staring at me with those careful eyes. Finally, he said, "When are you going to lock me out?" I thought I'd misheard him. I said, "Lock you out of what?" He gestured toward the back door and said, "Outside, when I'm bad." "When are you going to make me stay out there?" I put down the wooden spoon I'd been using to stir pasta sauce and turned to face him fully. I said, "Daniel, I'm not going to lock you outside, ever. Why would you think that?" His expression shifted to confusion, genuine confusion, as if I'd just told him the sky wasn't blue. He said, "Because that's what happens when you break rules or talk back or don't do what you're told. You have to stay outside until you learn." The casual way he said it, the matter-of-fact tone describing abuse as inevitable consequence, told me everything I needed to know about where he'd been before he came to me. I pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down so I was closer to his eye level. Daniel was 9 years old, small for his age, with sandy brown hair that fell across his forehead and a spray of freckles across his nose. He'd been placed with me through emergency foster care 3 weeks earlier, after his previous placement disrupted suddenly. My caseworker, a woman named Patricia Okonkwo, had been vague about the reasons, citing an ongoing investigation. She'd said Daniel needed a stable home immediately and asked if I could take him. I'd been certified as a foster parent for 6 months, but this was my first placement. I'd gone through the training after my divorce was finalized, needing something to fill the silence in my house and wanting to help kids who needed it. Patricia had warned me Daniel might be withdrawn or have behavioral issues, but so far, he'd been almost unnervingly compliant. Now I understood why. I said, "Daniel, nobody is going to lock you outside here. That's not a punishment I use. That's not something that should ever happen to a child." He processed this slowly, his face showing doubt. He said, "But what if I'm really bad? What if I do something wrong?" I asked him to tell me what he meant by really bad. He listed things in a flat voice. Talking back, not finishing dinner, making noise after bedtime, forgetting chores, asking for things, crying, complaining about being cold or hungry or tired. The list was heartbreaking. Normal child behaviors framed as offenses worthy of severe punishment. I asked the question I was afraid to hear answered. "Daniel, at your last home, how often did they lock you outside?" He thought about it carefully, calculating. He said, "Maybe 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes more if it was a bad week. Sometimes I'd be out there just for a few hours after dinner, sometimes all night if I did something really wrong." All night. A 9-year-old locked outside overnight. I kept my voice steady and asked what really wrong meant. He said, "Like the time I came inside without permission, because it was raining really hard and I was scared of the thunder. Mr. Brennan said I was being defiant and I had to stay outside for 2 nights to learn that his rules were more important than being comfortable. 2 nights. In the rain. Because a child was frightened of a storm. I felt rage building but contained it because Daniel was watching my reaction carefully. I said, "That should never have happened to you. Adults are supposed to keep children safe, not lock them outside. What Mr. Brennan did was wrong." Daniel looked uncertain, processing information that contradicted everything he'd been taught. He said, "But Mr. Brennan said outside time was character building. He said it taught us self-reliance and discipline and respect for authority." The words sounded rehearsed, things he'd been told repeatedly until he internalized them. I asked if other children in the home had been locked outside too. Daniel nodded and said, "All of us. There were 6 kids living there. We all had outside time when we needed correction. 6 children, all subjected to outdoor isolation as routine punishment. I asked if he'd ever told anyone about this, a teacher or caseworker. He shook his head and said, "Mr. Brennan told us that if we complained to outsiders, we'd be taken away and put somewhere much worse where they'd actually hurt us." He said outside time was gentle discipline compared to what other foster parents did. He said we should be grateful he wasn't hitting us or starving us. The manipulation was sophisticated, framing abuse as mercy, convincing traumatized children that speaking up would result in worse harm. I asked when the last time he'd been locked outside was. Daniel said, "The night before I got moved here, I asked if I could have a second helping at dinner, and Mr. Brennan said asking for more showed greed and lack of gratitude. I was outside from 7 at night until the caseworker came in the morning to pick me up. I thought I was in trouble for asking for food, but then she said I was leaving, and I had to pack my stuff." I called Patricia Okonkwo that evening after Daniel went to bed. I told her everything he'd disclosed about being locked outside as punishment, the frequency, the duration, the other children involved. There was a long silence on the line before Patricia said, "Thomas, I need you to understand something. Daniel was removed from the Brennan home as part of an emergency extraction. We received a report from a neighbor who'd seen children locked outside at night in cold weather. When we investigated, we found the situation was worse than reported. All 6 children were removed immediately. We're building a case, but it's complicated because the Brennans have been licensed foster parents for 8 years with no previous complaints." 8 years. How many children had they abused during that time? I asked what the specific allegations were. Patricia said she couldn't share details of an active investigation, but confirmed that outdoor isolation was a significant part of the complaint. She said a detective would need to interview Daniel formally to document his experiences. She asked if he seemed traumatized by the disclosure. I told her he'd described being locked outside overnight in storms as if it were completely normal, which was perhaps more disturbing than if he'd been visibly upset. Patricia scheduled an interview with Detective James Kowalski for the following week. The next few days revealed more concerning patterns. Daniel would stand at the back door sometimes in the evening, just staring outside, and when I asked what he was looking at, he'd say, "Nothing, just checking the weather." I realized he was assessing conditions, mentally preparing for outdoor punishment that wasn't coming. At night, I'd hear him moving around his room, and when I checked on him, he'd be fully dressed in layers, wearing his jacket, lying on top of the covers. I asked why he wasn't in his pajamas under the blankets, and he said, "In case I have to go outside, it's faster if I'm already dressed." The practical adaptation to routine abuse broke my heart. He'd learned to sleep prepared for punishment. I told him he wouldn't be going outside at night, that he could wear pajamas and get under the covers and be comfortable. He nodded, but the next night I found him dressed in layers again. The behavior was too ingrained to change with reassurance. At school, his teacher called to express concern. Mrs. Jacobson said Daniel refused to go outside for recess. When she'd insisted, saying all students needed outdoor time, he'd become panicked and said he'd do anything she wanted. He'd be perfect. Just please don't make him go outside. Mrs. Jacobson said she'd let him stay in the classroom during recess, but wanted to know what was going on. I explained generally that Daniel had come from a difficult situation and had negative associations with being outdoors. Mrs. Jacobson was understanding and said she'd work with him gradually. That evening, I asked Daniel about recess. He said, "I thought if I went outside, maybe the teacher wouldn't let me back in. I thought it might be a test to see if I'd complain about being cold." The fear was so deep and so specific. He'd been conditioned to see outdoor space as punishment zone, not play area. Over the next week, I learned more about the Brennan household through Daniel's casual comments. He'd mention things in passing, not understanding they were revelations of abuse. He said once, "At least your garage is heated. Mr. Brennan's garage wasn't. So when we had to sleep out there, it was really cold." "Sleep in the garage?" I asked when that happened. Daniel said, If all the outside spots were full because multiple kids needed correction at the same time, someone would have to sleep in the garage instead. It was better than being completely outside, but there were spiders. Multiple children locked outside simultaneously, a rotation system for punishment space. I asked how they decided who went where. Daniel explained there was a shed in the backyard, a covered porch, and open yard space. The shed was considered best because it blocked wind. The porch was okay. Open yard was worst, especially in rain. Kids who'd committed worse offenses got worse spots. It was a hierarchy of suffering, and Daniel described it with the same tone someone might use to explain seating arrangements at school. I asked what the worst offense was that he'd committed that resulted in outdoor punishment. He thought about it and said, "Probably when I cried because I missed my mom. I was 6 then. I'd just gotten placed with the Brennans, and I didn't understand yet that crying was against the rules. Mr. Brennan said I needed to toughen up and learn that emotions were weakness. I was outside for 2 days and nights. After that, I learned not to cry." 2 days and nights. A 6-year-old locked outside for crying about missing his mother. I asked where his mother was now. Daniel said, "She died. That's why I got put in foster care. I don't remember her much anymore." The casual delivery of this tragedy, combined with the revelation that he'd been punished for grieving, made me understand the depth of damage inflicted by the Brennans. They'd taken traumatized children who'd already lost everything and punished them for having normal emotional responses to trauma. I asked if Mr. Brennan had a wife, if there was a Mrs. Brennan involved. Daniel nodded and said, "Mrs. Brennan was in charge of daytime. She'd decide if you needed outside time during the day. Mr. Brennan handled nighttime punishments." Both foster parents actively participating in the abuse, a system they'd developed together and refined over years. I asked if caseworkers ever came to the house. Daniel said, "Sometimes, but we always knew when they were coming. Mr. Brennan would tell us the day before and we'd practice what to say. We had to say everything was great and we loved living there, and we were grateful for the structure and discipline. If we said the right things, we wouldn't get outside time that week. Coached responses, staged visits, rewards for lying to investigators. The Brennans had created a comprehensive system to hide their abuse." I asked if the caseworkers ever came unannounced. Daniel said he didn't remember that ever happening. They always seemed to visit on schedule. When Detective Kowalski came to interview Daniel, he was a man in his 50s with a patient demeanor and kind eyes. He explained to Daniel that he was investigating what happened at the Brennan home and needed to hear Daniel's experiences. He promised Daniel wasn't in trouble, and nothing he said would result in punishment. Daniel was hesitant, but agreed to talk. Kowalski recorded the interview and asked Daniel to describe a typical week at the Brennan home. Daniel explained the routine, the rules, the punishment system. Kowalski asked specific questions about outdoor isolation. How often it happened, how long it lasted, what the weather conditions were, whether he was given food or water or blankets, whether he was allowed to come inside to use the bathroom. Daniel answered each question in that same flat, mechanical voice, describing abuse in terms he'd been taught were normal discipline. He said they weren't usually given food during outside time because the point was to learn from discomfort. Sometimes Mrs. Brennan would bring water if it was hot outside, but not always. There was no bathroom access. If you needed to go, you just went in the yard and hoped you didn't get in more trouble for it. Blankets were only allowed if you were outside for more than one night, and only if the temperature dropped below freezing. Mr. Brennan said anything above freezing was survivable and character building. Kowalski's expression remained professional, but I saw his jaw tighten. He asked if Daniel had ever seen any of the other children get injured during outside time. Daniel nodded and said, "One girl, Maya, she was 7. She got locked outside during a snowstorm. When they let her in the next morning, her fingers were purple and she couldn't stop shaking. Mrs. Brennan said she was being dramatic, but later they took her to the hospital. We were told to say she'd been playing outside and lost track of time. A 7-year-old with frostbite from forced outdoor exposure, and the foster parents coached the children to lie about it. Kowalski asked if Daniel knew what happened to Maya after the hospital. Daniel said, "She got moved to a different foster home. Mr. Brennan said she wasn't tough enough for their family, but I think maybe the hospital people asked too many questions." Kowalski made notes and asked about the night before Daniel was removed, when he'd been locked outside for asking for a second helping at dinner. Daniel described it in detail. How Mr. Brennan had stood up from the table and pointed at the back door and said, "Outside, you can come back in when you've learned gratitude." How he'd stood on the back porch for an hour before Mr. Brennan came out and said the porch was too comfortable, that he needed to stand in the open yard. How it had gotten cold as night fell, and he'd tried to stay warm by moving around, but Mr. Brennan had yelled from the window that standing still was part of the discipline. How he'd stood there for hours, shivering, watching the lights go off in the house one by one as everyone went to bed. How he'd eventually sat down on the cold ground because his legs were shaking too much to stand. How he'd fallen asleep briefly and woken up disoriented and freezing. How the sun had finally come up, and Mrs. Brennan had opened the door and told him to come inside and pack his things because his caseworker was coming. Kowalski asked how Daniel had felt when the caseworker arrived. Daniel said, "Scared. I thought I was being moved because I'd been so bad that even the Brennans didn't want me anymore. I thought I was going somewhere worse. Patricia didn't tell me why I was leaving until we were in the car, and even then she didn't say much. I figured out later it wasn't because of me." The trauma of believing his removal was punishment for his own failure rather than rescue from abuse showed how thoroughly the Brennans had warped his understanding of adult behavior. After the interview, Kowalski told me this was consistent with what they'd heard from the other 5 children removed from the home. All of them described routine outdoor isolation, extended exposure to extreme temperatures, and sophisticated coaching to hide the abuse from investigators. He said the Brennans would be charged with multiple counts of child abuse and endangerment. The district attorney, Leslie Huang, was building a case and would likely want Daniel to testify if it went to trial. Kowalski said, "Thomas, I need you to understand the scope of what we're uncovering. The Brennans have been licensed foster parents for 8 years. We're trying to track down every child who was placed with them during that time. So far, we've identified at least 18 children who lived there at various points. 18 children over 8 years, potentially all subjected to the same abuse. I asked how the system had missed this for so long. Kowalski said, "The Brennans were careful, scheduled visits, coached responses, strategic medical care when necessary but with plausible explanations. The neighbor who finally reported them had been watching for months, documenting times when children were outside at night in bad weather before she felt she had enough evidence to make a report that would be taken seriously. Even then, the initial investigation might have been cursory if she hadn't been persistent. One neighbor's persistence had potentially saved dozens of children from ongoing abuse." I asked what happened now. Kowalski said the investigation was moving forward. The Brennans had been arrested immediately after the children were removed. They'd posted bail and were awaiting trial. He warned me that if the case went to court and Daniel testified, it would be difficult. Defense attorneys would try to discredit the children, suggest they were troubled kids exaggerating normal discipline. I needed to prepare Daniel for that possibility. Over the next several weeks, Daniel slowly started to relax, though progress wasn't linear. He still slept in layers some nights. He still hoarded food in his room, though now it was snacks I'd told him he could keep there rather than hidden contraband. He started therapy with Dr. Grace Adeyemi, who specialized in childhood trauma. Dr. Adeyemi said Daniel showed classic signs of complex trauma from prolonged exposure to unpredictable punishment. The outdoor isolation had been particularly damaging because it combined physical suffering, emotional abandonment, and environmental fear. Children locked outside at night experienced terror of darkness, vulnerability to weather, fear of animals or strangers, and the psychological anguish of being literally shut out by the people supposed to care for them. She said recovery would take time and consistency. Daniel needed to learn that home was safe, that adults could be trusted, that his basic needs would be met unconditionally. The breakthrough came 6 weeks after Daniel moved in with me. It was late November, getting properly cold, and I'd mentioned we should get him a heavier winter coat. He'd nodded but hadn't seemed enthusiastic. That evening, I found him in the backyard at dusk, standing in the cold without a jacket, just standing there. I went outside and asked what he was doing. He said, "Testing. I wanted to see if I could still do it, stand outside in the cold. I wanted to know if I was tough enough." I understood. He was trying to prove to himself that he'd survived, that the Brennans hadn't broken him. I said, "Daniel, you don't need to test yourself. You don't need to prove you're tough. You're a kid. You're allowed to be cold and come inside." He looked at me with tears in his eyes, the first real emotion I'd seen from him, and said, "What if you change your mind? What if I mess up and you decide I need outside time too? I need to know I can handle it." I knelt down in the cold grass and said, "I will never lock you outside. I will never use that as punishment. I will never make you prove you can endure suffering. You are safe here, and safe means you don't have to prepare for me to hurt you." He started crying then, actually crying, and I pulled him into a hug. He was shaking from cold and emotion both, and I said, "Let's go inside where it's warm." He nodded against my shoulder and we went in. That night, he wore pajamas to bed and got under the covers. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental. The trial was scheduled for March, 4 months after the children's removal. District Attorney Huang called me to discuss Daniel's testimony. She said, "Thomas, I'll be direct. The Brennans' defense strategy is to frame the outdoor time as reasonable discipline for defiant children. They're claiming the children exaggerate normal timeouts, that being outside for brief periods is not abusive, that the children's trauma histories make them unreliable witnesses. Having Daniel testify about specific incidents, duration, weather conditions, and physical suffering would strengthen our case significantly." I asked if she could convict without Daniel's testimony. Leslie said, "Probably, yes. We have testimony from the other children, medical records, the neighbors' documentation, and expert witnesses. But Daniel's testimony would be powerful because he's articulate and specific. The jury needs to understand this wasn't brief timeouts. It was extended exposure amounting to torture." I talked to Dr. Adeyemi about whether Daniel was ready to testify. She said, "Testifying could be empowering, giving him a voice in his own justice, or it could be re-traumatizing, forcing him to relive trauma while his abusers watch. I think Daniel should decide." When I asked Daniel if he wanted to tell the judge what happened at the Brennan home, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "If I tell, will it help make sure they can't do this to other kids?" I said yes, that was exactly what it would do. He took a deep breath and said, "Then I'll tell. I'm scared, but I'll do it." The trial began on a cold Monday in March. The courtroom was packed with social workers, media, and concerned community members. The Brennans sat at the defense table looking respectable and wounded, as if they were the victims of false accusations. Their attorney, a sharp woman named Alicia Vance, gave an opening statement framing them as dedicated foster parents who'd devoted 8 years to helping troubled children, using structured discipline to teach responsibility and resilience. Leslie Huang's opening was devastating. She described a systematic pattern of abuse spanning 8 years and at least 18 children. She outlined how the Brennans had used outdoor isolation as routine punishment, sometimes for days at a time, in conditions ranging from rainstorms to snow to extreme heat. She described children with hypothermia, dehydration, frostbite. She said the evidence would show this wasn't discipline, it was torture, and the Brennans had profited from state foster care payments while abusing vulnerable children. The first week of trial brought testimony from the other children removed from the Brennan home. Each one described similar experiences with outdoor isolation. A 12-year-old girl named Sierra testified she'd been locked outside for 3 days in January for talking back. She described how her lips had cracked and bled from cold and dehydration, how she'd begged to come inside to use the bathroom and been ignored, how she'd thought she was going to die. An 8-year-old boy named Marcus testified about being locked in the shed during a thunderstorm, terrified of the lightning, banging on the door and screaming until his voice gave out while Mr. Brennan yelled at him to be quiet and learn self-control. A 10-year-old girl named Jasmine described being locked outside overnight when she was 7 years old because she'd wet the bed. She said she'd been so scared of the dark that she'd stood against the house wall all night, too frightened to sit down. Each testimony was heartbreaking and damning. The defense attorney cross-examined aggressively, trying to suggest the children were exaggerating or confused, but their stories were too consistent and too detailed. Medical records corroborated their accounts. A pediatrician testified about treating Maya for frostbite after the snowstorm exposure, noting his suspicions had been documented at the time, but no action had been taken. A child psychologist explained how the outdoor isolation created severe psychological trauma that forced exposure to elements combined with deliberate abandonment by caregivers was recognized as torture when used in military or prison settings and was equally damaging to children. The defense called character witnesses who testified that the Brennans were respected members of their church and community, dedicated to helping children. The defense strategy seemed to be painting them as misunderstood strict parents rather than abusers. Daniel testified on day 6 of the trial. Leslie had prepared him carefully, explaining he just needed to tell the truth. In the courtroom, I sat where Daniel could see me. When his name was called, he walked to the witness stand with his shoulders straight, trying to be brave. Leslie asked him to state his name and age. He said, "Daniel Christopher Whitmore, 9 years old." Hearing him use my last name, even though the adoption wasn't finalized yet, made my throat tight. Leslie asked Daniel to describe what daily life was like at the Brennan home. He explained the rules, the expectations, the punishment system. She asked him to describe what happened when children broke rules. Daniel said, "Mr. Brennan would say you needed outside time to think about what you'd done. He'd tell you how long you had to stay out there. Sometimes a few hours, sometimes overnight, sometimes longer." Leslie asked how often this happened to him. Daniel said, maybe 3 or 4 times a week on average, sometimes more. Leslie asked him to describe specific incidents. Daniel talked about being locked outside for crying about his mother, about standing in the rain for asking a question during dinner, about spending 2 nights outside for coming in without permission during a thunderstorm, about the final night before removal when he'd asked for more food. His voice stayed mostly steady, but occasionally cracked with emotion. Leslie asked what it felt like being locked outside at night. Daniel said, "Scary. Really scary. It's dark and you can hear animals and wind and you don't know if something bad will happen. You're cold or hot depending on the weather. Your body hurts from standing or sitting on the ground. But the worst part is knowing the people inside the house, the people who are supposed to take care of you, they just don't care that you're suffering." The jury was visibly affected. Several members were crying. Leslie asked if Mr. and Mrs. Brennan ever told the children what to say if anyone asked about the outdoor time. Daniel described the coaching sessions, the rehearsed responses, the threats about being moved somewhere worse if they complained. Then came cross-examination. Alicia Vance approached Daniel with a gentle voice that felt calculated. She said, "Daniel, you've had a difficult life, haven't you? You've been in multiple foster homes?" Daniel said, "Yes, ma'am." Vance asked, "And isn't it true that you've had behavior problems in previous placements?" Daniel looked confused and said, "I don't know, ma'am. Vance pressed. Your records indicate difficulty with authority. Is it possible that what you're calling punishment was actually Mr. and Mrs. B. Brennan trying to teach you to follow rules? Leslie objected immediately. The judge sustained. Vance tried another angle. Daniel, the outdoor area at the Brennan home had a covered porch and a shed, correct? Daniel said, Yes, ma'am. Vance said, So you weren't always exposed to direct weather? Daniel said, Sometimes we were on the porch or in the shed. Sometimes we weren't. It depended on what Mr. Brennan decided. Vance asked, And you were never physically harmed, were you? No bruises or broken bones? Daniel said quietly, I had frostbite on my toes once, and I got really sick from being rained on all night. Vance seemed to realize this line of questioning wasn't helping and wrapped up quickly. After Daniel's testimony, the trial continued with expert witnesses and closing arguments. Leslie's closing was powerful. She said, The defense wants you to believe this was discipline, but discipline teaches, torture punishes. Locking a 6-year-old outside for 2 days for crying about his dead mother isn't teaching, it's cruelty. Forcing a 7-year-old to stand in a snowstorm until she gets frostbite isn't structure, it's sadism. The Brennans didn't help these children. They tortured them systematically for 8 years while collecting state payments for their care. They don't deserve your sympathy. They deserve justice. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Robert and Patrick Brennan were convicted of 18 counts of child abuse, 6 counts of child endangerment, fraud, and conspiracy. The courtroom erupted when the verdicts were read. I looked at Daniel, and he was crying silently. But this time, it looked like relief. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Parents of former foster children gave victim impact statements. The neighbor who'd made the initial report testified about months of watching children shivering outside at night before she finally called authorities. Daniel gave a statement too. He'd written it with Dr. Adeyemi's help. He said, The Brennans made me think I deserved to suffer. They made me think being cold and scared and alone was my fault for not being good enough. It took months with someone who actually cared about me before I could even start to believe that wasn't true. What they did wasn't discipline. It was torture. And they did it to a lot of kids for a lot of years. They should never be allowed near children again. The judge sentenced Robert Brennan to 20 years in state prison and Patricia Brennan to 18 years. The judge said, You took vulnerable children who'd already experienced trauma and inflicted additional cruelty under the guise of discipline. You manipulated the system designed to protect them. You prioritized control and profit over their well-being and safety. Your actions constitute some of the most egregious abuse of foster parent authority this court has seen. As the Brennans were led away, Patricia looked back with an expression of indignation, as if she still believed she'd done nothing wrong. The foster care system underwent significant reforms following the case. Mandatory unannounced home visits were implemented. New protocols required children to be interviewed privately, without foster parents present. Temperature monitoring systems were proposed for outdoor areas of foster homes. Patricia Okonkwo, my caseworker, became an advocate for reform, saying she'd never forgive herself for not catching the abuse during scheduled visits. The investigation eventually identified 23 children who'd been placed with the Brennans over 8 years. Most confirmed experiencing outdoor isolation punishment. Several had medical records consistent with exposure-related injuries that had been explained away at the time. The state reached settlements with the families, though no amount of money could undo the damage inflicted. Daniel's adoption was finalized 6 months after the trial. The judge who'd sentenced the Brennans wasn't the same judge handling the adoption, but word had spread. The adoption judge said, Daniel, I've read about what you survived and your courage in testifying. I'm honored to make official what's already true in your hearts. Thomas is your father, and you are his son. Now, 3 years later, Daniel is 12 years old and in 7th grade. He still sees Dr. Adeyemi monthly. He plays soccer and does well in school. He has friends and sleepovers and normal kid problems. He still has moments when trauma resurfaces. Last winter, during a snowstorm, I found him standing at the window watching the snow fall with a tense expression. He said, "I used to be so scared of snow." I said, "You don't have to be scared anymore." He nodded and said, "I know. But sometimes I remember anyway." Those moments are fewer now, farther apart. Last week we were sitting at dinner and he said something I'd been waiting years to hear. He said, "Dad, I'm glad you never locked me out." I said, "I never would have." He smiled and said, "I know that now. It just took me a while to believe it." That conversation felt like closure on the question that had started everything. My child asked why I hadn't locked him out yet, and through years of patience and love and justice, he'd finally learned that home means safety without conditions. The Brennans are in prison where they belong. Daniel is thriving, and sometimes that has to be enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.